The camera glides slowly over the frost-covered vineyards of the Rheingau in the pale winter light of 1945, lingering on the skeletal vines that stretch toward the ruined silhouette of Schloss Rothschild at Königstein, its once proud towers shattered by Allied bombs, its cellars already emptied by men in field-gray uniforms who had come years earlier with different intentions. Here, in the heart of what had been the greatest private banking empire the world had ever known, there is only silence, broken occasionally by the creaking of a broken window frame swaying in the wind. Yet beneath this silence lies one of the most meticulously documented and yet still incompletely told stories of systematic cultural annihilation in the 20th century. The deliberate looting of more than 200 palaces, châteaux, villas, and city mansions that had belonged to the descendants of a single Jewish coin dealer from the Frankfurt Judengasse, named Meyer Amschel Rothschild. To understand how the most powerful financial dynasty in European history could be stripped of its physical memory in the space of less than a decade, we must return to the narrow, overcrowded lane in Frankfurt, where it all began. In the year 1744, Meyer Amschel Rothschild was born into a community hemmed in by medieval walls and medieval prejudices. The Judengasse, barely 12 feet wide in places, housed more than 3,000 souls behind a gate that was locked every night and on Christian holidays. Red shields, rotes Schild, hung above the doorway of the house zur Hinterpfan, and it was this emblem that Meyer Amschel would transform into the most recognizable heraldic device in global finance. As a boy, he collected and traded antique coins. As a young man, he supplied rare metals to Prince Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel, one of the richest men in Europe. Wilhelm, who famously hired out his subjects as mercenaries to the British Crown during the American Revolutionary War, recognized in the quiet, meticulous dealer from the Ghetto an almost supernatural talent for discretion and calculation. By the 1790s, Meyer Amschel had become court agent to the Landgrave and was quietly moving bullion and bills of exchange across a continent convulsed by the Napoleonic Wars. It was the perfect apprenticeship for what would come next. When Meyer Amschel died in 1812, he left behind 5 sons and an instruction that would shape 2 centuries of European history. The business must remain in the family, marriages must be arranged within a tight circle of cousins, and daughters must be married off to titled aristocrats who needed cash to maintain their crumbling estates. The 5 arrows of the Rothschild coat of arms, each son dispatched to a different capital: Vienna, London, Paris, Naples, and Frankfurt itself, became the living embodiment of that strategy. Within a single generation, the family financed the Duke of Wellington's armies, underwrote the French war indemnity of 1871, built railways from the Crimea to Cuba, and lent money to emperors and republics alike. Their palaces reflected that ascent with an opulence that stunned even the old nobility. The Château de Ferrières, outside Paris, designed by Joseph Paxton of Crystal Palace fame, with its 250-foot-long gallery and stag-headed marble staircase. The Palais Rothschild on the Rheingasse in Vienna, 4 separate mansions connected by underground passages. Mentmore Towers in Buckinghamshire, an Elizabethan prodigy house built for Baron Mayer de Rothschild with money earned from the Suez Canal share deal. Waddesdon Manor, the Loire-style fantasy of Ferdinand Rothschild, stuffed with Sèvres porcelain and Fragonard panels. The Villa Gunthersburg in Frankfurt, surrounded by English gardens that once required the labor of 100 men to maintain. These were not merely homes. They were diplomatic instruments, cultural arsenals, and visible proof that the barriers of the Judengasse had been shattered forever. Every Rothschild residence was conceived as a total work of art. Libraries lined with first editions bound in Morocco leather, armories displaying Renaissance parade armor, galleries where Gainsboroughs hung beside Rembrandt teas, wine cellars holding pre-phylloxera clarets laid down by Talleyrand himself. The family's passion for collecting was almost pathological. Baron Wilhelm Karl von Rothschild in Frankfurt alone owned more than 5,000 old master drawings, while his cousin Nathaniel in Vienna filled the Palais on Hugas with Maiolica and Limoges enamels, that had once belonged to the Habsburgs themselves. The architectural expression of this wealth reached its zenith in the Gründerzeit and Belle Époque, when the Viennese Ringstrasse branch alone erected 8 palaces within a mile of one another, each more extravagant than the last, until Emperor Franz Joseph is said to have muttered, "The Rothschilds are building a new Vienna inside my Vienna." Yet beneath the brilliance lay a persistent anxiety. The family never forgot that their ascent had been built on revocable tolerance. Anti-Semitic broadsheets in the 1840s already accused them of controlling the world's money supply. Edouard Drumon's La France Juive in 1886 devoted entire chapters to the Rothschild octopus. Every financial crisis, every stock market panic brought fresh denunciations. The Dreyfus affair in France, the Tiszaislar blood libel in Hungary, the Baylis trial in Kiev, all reminded the family that the thrones and parliaments to which they lent billions could turn against them overnight. That is why, even at the height, are building a new Vienna inside my Vienna. Yet beneath the brilliance lay a persistent anxiety. The family never forgot that their ascent had been built on revocable tolerance. Anti-Semitic broadsheets in the 1840s already accused them of controlling the world's money supply. Edouard Drumon's La France Juive in 1886 devoted entire chapters to the Rothschild octopus. Every financial crisis, every stock market panic brought fresh denunciations. The Dreyfus affair in France, the Tiszaislar blood libel in Hungary, the Baylis trial in Kiev, all reminded the family that the thrones and parliaments to which they lent billions could turn against them overnight. That is why, even at the height, still lived in Germany. Baron Louis von Rothschild in Vienna. The Austrian and German branches had intermarried so often they were practically one, and his cousin, Baron Eugen von Rothschild, whose Schloss Hinterleiten stood in the Austrian countryside. Louis, the last head of the Kreditanstalt in Vienna, was a cultivated, gentle man who spent his evenings listening to Schubert Lieder in the music room of the Palais Rothschild on Prinz Eugenstrasse. He could not imagine that within 5 years, every note of that music would be silenced. The Anschluss of March 1938 changed everything in a single weekend. On the morning of 13th March, Louis von Rothschild was arrested at Vienna airport while attempting to leave for Switzerland. He was taken directly to the Hotel Metropole, which the Gestapo had made its headquarters, and informed that he would remain a hostage until the family surrendered control of the Witkowitz steelworks in Czechoslovakia, then the largest in Central Europe. Over the next 18 months, Louis endured solitary confinement in cell 37, his weight dropping from 180 to 120 pounds, while his cousins in London and Paris negotiated with Reichsbank President Hjalmar Schacht and SS Gruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich for his release. The price finally agreed in July 1939 was staggering: the complete transfer of the Austrian Rothschild assets, including all palaces, art collections, forests, and bank accounts, in exchange for Louis's freedom and exit visas for 32 family members. It remains the single largest documented act of state-sanctioned extortion in history. But the looting had already begun long before the papers were signed. Even while Baron Louis languished in the metropole, squads from the Gestapo and the SS Ahnenerbe were moving through the Viennese palaces with the methodical precision of accountants conducting an audit of the apocalypse. On the very evening of 13th March 1938, trucks arrived at the Palais Rothschild at Prinz Eugenstrasse 26. The staff, many of whom had served the family for 3 generations, were ordered to stand aside while heilmen in leather coats carried out crates marked with the 5-arrow ex libris. The inventory compiled that night, preserved today in the Austrian State Archives, reads like a blasphemous reversal of the Book of Genesis: 3,447 paintings and watercolors, 672 tapestries, 300 carpets, 514 pieces of Sèvres and Meissen porcelain, 178 marble statues, 1,200 pieces of Renaissance and Baroque furniture, and an entire library of 25,000 volumes, including a Gutenberg Bible on vellum that had once belonged to the Habsburgs. All of it was loaded onto railway wagons bound for the central depot in the Neue Burg in Vienna, the same imperial palace from which the Rothschilds had once been excluded as Jews. What is less well known is that the looting was not chaotic. It was choreographed. Adolf Eichmann himself, newly installed as Jews' advisor on Jewish affairs in Vienna, established a dedicated office called the Zentralstelle für jüdische Auswanderung, whose real purpose was the systematic registration and expropriation of Jewish property. Within weeks, every Rothschild residence in Austria was assigned a Kommissarischer Verwalter, a state-appointed administrator, whose job was to catalog, photograph, and prepare the contents for distribution. The palaces themselves were repurposed with chilling speed. The Palais at Hugas, 4-6, became the headquarters of the Reichsstatthalter Arthur Seyss in Quart. The Palais on Rengas housed the Gestapo's Jewish emigration department. The magnificent Palais Albert Rothschild on Prinz Eugenstrasse was handed over to the SS for use as an officer's quarters. The family's hunting lodge at Langau was turned into a training camp for the Hitler Youth. Even the vineyards at Grinzing were placed under the control of the Reichsnährstand, the Nazi agricultural authority. Across the border in Germany, the process had begun earlier and was even more ruthless. After the November pogrom of 1938, known as Kristallnacht, the Frankfurt Rothschilds' last remaining properties were Aryanized overnight. The Villa Günthersburg, with its English park and/or Angery, was seized by the city of Frankfurt and turned into the headquarters of the Gau Hessen-Nassau. The Palais Rothschild on Untermain-Kai, once the scene of glittering balls attended by Kaiser Wilhelm II, was handed to the Deutsche Bank. The family library of 40,000 volumes, one of the finest private collections in Germany, was dispersed between the University of Frankfurt and the Preußischer Kulturbesitz in Berlin. Baroness Clarice de Rothschild, widow of Eugen, fled to New York with only 2 suitcases and a single painting, a small Watteau sketch that she hid inside a hatbox. In France, the pattern repeated itself with the fall of Paris in June 1940. The Château de Ferrières, the large saint-private residence in Europe, was requisitioned first by the Wehrmacht and then by Hermann Göring personally, who used it as a weekend retreat. On the 21st October 1940, Göring arrived with his art advisors and spent 3 days selecting the best pieces for his own collection at Carenhall. The inventory of what was taken that weekend includes 23 paintings by Fragonard, Boucher, and Lancret, a complete service of Sèvres porcelain made for Marie Antoinette, and the famous Rothschild girandoles, massive silver candelabra commissioned by Meyer Amschel himself in 1803. What Göring did not want was shipped to the Rue de Paume in Paris, where the ERR, Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, processed more than 22,000 objects stolen from Jewish collections. The Rothschild name appears on 1,200 inventory cards alone. The most heartbreaking chapter unfolded at the Château de Ferrières itself. The head gardener, Émile Loret, who had worked for the family since 1898, remained on the estate throughout the war and kept a secret diary. He recorded how, in the winter of 1941, French collaborators working for the Vichy regime removed the entire contents of the wine cellar, 18,000 bottles, including Chateau Lafite, 1870, laid down by Baron James de Rothschild personally. Loret watched as the marble statues in the Grand Salon were wrapped in straw and loaded onto trucks bound for Munich, where Hitler planned his Führer Museum in Linz. When the war ended, Loret walked through the empty palace and found only the ghosts of its former glory. A single Sèvres plate shattered on the parquet floor, a torn fragment of a Gobelins tapestry fluttering from a broken window. By the spring of 1941, the physical map of Rothschild Europe had been almost entirely erased. In Czechoslovakia, the great palace of the Moravian branch at Schillersdorf was occupied by the Waffen-SS. In Hungary, the estates around Venkheim and Gödöllő were handed to Aerocross leaders. In the Netherlands, the The Château de Armanvilliers, outside Paris, purchased by Baron Edmond in 1875, became a convalescent home for Luftwaffe pilots. Yet the most symbolically devastating loss occurred in the quiet spa town of Bad Ischl, where the Villa Rothschild, a delicate neo-Renaissance jewel overlooking the Traun River, had been the favorite summer retreat of Emperor Franz Joseph himself. In August 1941, the villa was requisitioned by Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, who intended to turn the entire Salzkammergut into a restricted zone for the SS elite. The contents, including the Empress Elizabeth's personal writing desk and a collection of ivory miniatures once belonging to Marie Antoinette, were packed into 127 crates and sent to the salt mines at Althusser, where they were stored alongside the Ghent altarpiece and Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna. What makes this systematic despoliation so chilling is how legal it was made itself appear. Every seizure was accompanied by reams of paperwork, notarized inventories, stamped transfer protocols, tax assessments calculated to the Pfennig. In Vienna, the Vugesta, Vermögensumzugsgesellschaft für jüdische Auswanderer, was created specifically to auction off Jewish household goods. Rothschild silver was sold at the Dorotheum for fractions of its value, while the family's Stradivarius violins were handed to musicians of the Vienna Philharmonic as gifts from the Führer. The language of bureaucracy became the perfect camouflage for genocide. When Baroness Clarice de Rothschild wrote from New York in 1942, begging for news of her library, the Reichsstelle für Sippenforschung replied that her request could not be processed because persons of Jewish blood are no longer entitled to cultural property. Yet even in the darkest hours, there were flickers of resistance. In Paris, the curator of the Jeu de Paume, Rose Valland, a quiet, bespectacled Frenchwoman, secretly recorded every painting that passed through the museum on index cards hidden in her apartment. Her clandestine lists include 162 works from the Rothschild collections alone, with precise notations of which train left for Germany and on what date. In Vienna, a junior archivist named Herbert Göring risked his life copying Gestapo files on the Rothschild palaces before they were sent to Berlin. In the cellars of the Neue Burg, two Jewish forced laborers, Erich Lederer and Leo Planiskik, were ordered to catalog the confiscated art. Instead, they memorized room layouts and hid small objects in their clothing. These acts of defiance, tiny in themselves, would become the threads from which the tapestry of restitution would later be rewoven. As the tide of war turned, the Nazis began frantically moving their plunder eastward. In the autumn of 1944, as Soviet armies approached Vienna, SS units loaded the remaining Rothschild collections onto special trains bound for the mines of Althusser and Merkers. One train carrying the library from the Palais Albert Rothschild was bombed near Linz. Charred pages from a 1493 Nuremberg chronicle fluttered across the Danube for days. Another convoy, including the complete Rothschild silver service of 1819, disappeared somewhere in Thuringia and has never been found. By April 1945, the American Third Army discovered 8,000 paintings, 2,200 crates of books, and 1.2 tons of gold in the Kaiserode salt mine at Merkers. Among them were 200 Rothschild objects, hastily wrapped in Wehrmacht blankets and still bearing the 5-arrow crest. When Baroness Philippine de Rothschild, then a young girl living in occupied Paris under a false name, learned that her father's chateau at Lafitte had been used as a German officer's mess, she later recalled feeling not hatred, but a strange, hollow grief, as if the house itself had died. That sense of bereavement was shared by every surviving member of the family. They had lost not merely objects, but the physical incarnation of their history. The table at which Nathan Rothschild received news of Waterloo, the bed in which Queen Victoria had slept at Ferrières, the library where Disraeli drafted the Suez Purchase. The palaces stood empty, their windows smashed, their gardens trampled by tank tracks, their very names erased from maps under the racial laws. The morning of 7th May 1945 broke cold and damp over TR, Austrian Alps. In the salt mine at Althusser, American soldiers of the 90th Infantry Division crawled through tunnels lined with dynamite and found themselves surrounded by the ghosts of Europe's murdered aristocracy. 8 Rothschild crates stood open like coffins, their contents strewn across the floor where retreating SS men had torn silk wrappings in search of hidden jewels. A lieutenant from Minnesota lifted a small bronze Renaissance horse and read the inscription on its base. Ex collectione Baronis Nathaniel de Rothschild, Vienna, 1884. He wrapped it in his field jacket and carried it into the daylight. The first of thousands of objects that would begin the long, painful journey home. But home, for the Rothschilds, no longer existed in the same way. When Baron Louis von Rothschild finally returned to Vienna in the autumn of 1946, after 8 years of exile in Vermont and Havana, he stood in the shell of the Palais on Prince Eugenstrasse and wept silently. The parquet floors had been ripped up for firewood. The frescoed ceilings were blackened by smoke from German stoves. The marble staircase was scarred by tank treads. He walked from room to room, touching the places where paintings had once hung, tracing the faint rectangles on the wallpaper like a blind man reading Braille. In the music salon, he found a single ivory piano key lying in the dust. He pocketed it and never spoke of that day again. The restitution process that followed was not the triumphant homecoming depicted in popular memory, but a labyrinthine ordeal that lasted decades. In Austria, the new Republican government, eager to distance itself from Nazi crimes, passed a series of laws in 1946 to 1947 ostensibly designed to return property to Jewish owners. In reality, many palaces had already been allocated to the occupying powers. The British used the Palais Albert Rothschild as their headquarters. The Soviets stripped the Palais Nathaniel for furniture to send to Moscow. The Americans turned Schillersdorf into a displaced persons camp. When Alphonse de Rothschild applied for the return of Ferrières found melted down in a Reichsbank vault, their Rococo scrolls reduced to ingots. Of the 3,447 paintings seized in Vienna in 1938, only 1,039 had been located by 1955. The rest had vanished into the black market that flourished between Munich and Buenos Aires, or lay hidden behind false walls in Bavarian farmhouses. Some losses were simply too intimate to quantify. At Waddesdon Manor in England, which had remained untouched because it belonged to the British branch, James de Rothschild opened a crate returned from Austria in 1947 and found his mother's childhood doll, its porcelain face smashed, its silk dress stained with boot polish. He closed the lid without a word and never opened the found melted down in a Reichsbank vault, their Rococo scrolls reduced to ingots. Of the 3,447 paintings seized in Vienna in 1938, only 1,639 had been located by 1955. The rest had vanished into the black market that flourished between Munich and Buenos Aires, or lay hidden behind false walls in Bavarian farmhouses. Some losses were simply too intimate to quantify. At Waddesdon Manor in England, which had remained untouched because it belonged to the British branch, James de Rothschild opened a crate returned from Austria in 1947 and found his mother's childhood doll, its porcelain face smashed, its silk dress stained with boot polish. He closed the lid without a word and never opened the tea crate again. In Paris, Guy de Rothschild discovered that the Germans had used the family chapel at Ferrières as a latrine. When he ordered it cleaned, workmen found Hebrew prayer books floating in the cesspit, yet the family refused to surrender entirely to grief. In 1949, Baron Elie de Rothschild, then 32 years old, stood in the ruined greenhouses of Ferrières and told journalists, "We will replant every tree, restore every panel, refill every cellar, not for vengeance, but so the world remembers what was almost destroyed." Over the next 30 years, the French Rothschilds spent what amounted to a second fortune doing exactly that. They tracked down paintings in Swiss bank vaults, bought back tapestries at Sotheby's under assumed names, commissioned exact replicas of lost furniture from the original 19th century workshops. When the original Fragonard panels from the Palais Rothschild in Vienna appeared at auction in New York in 1986, Ailey's son Nathaniel outbid the Getty Museum and hung them in the same sequence their great-grandfather had chosen a century earlier. By the late 1950s, the physical reconstruction of the great houses was well underway, yet the emotional reconstruction took far longer. The Rothschilds who returned to Europe after the war were not the same people who had fled in 1938-39. They had seen the yellow stars, the cattle wagons, the lists of the deported. They had learned that a name which once opened every door in Europe could now condemn an entire branch of the family to annihilation. In Austria alone, 163 members of the extended Rothschild clan perished in the Holocaust, most of them distant cousins from the smaller Moravian and Hungarian lines, whose palaces at Schillersdorf, Weidhofen, and Gödöllő were razed to the ground after the war to prevent any claim of return. The Viennese palaces that survived were handed back in such dilapidated condition that the cost of restoration exceeded their market value. One by one, the family made the wrenching decision to sell. In 1958, the Palais Albert Rothschild on Prince Eugenstrasse was demolished to make way for a Congress Center. In 1962, the Palais Nathaniel on Hugas became a parking garage. Today, only 2 of the original 8 Viennese Rothschild palaces still stand, and both are anonymous office buildings with no plaque to acknowledge what they once were. In France, the story was different, but no less bittersweet. When Guy de Rothschild reopened the Château de Ferrières to the public in 1975, after 25 years of meticulous restoration, he did so with a deliberate act of defiance. The first event was a charity ball for the French Red Cross, attended by President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. The invitation cards were printed on paper, watermarked with the 5 arrows. Guy confessed privately that walking through the rebuilt galleries felt like living inside a perfectly restored mausoleum. The laughter sounded too loud, the chandeliers too bright. He sold Ferrières to the University of Paris in 1976, and never spent another night there. The last great act of reclamation took place not in Europe, but in the auction rooms and law courts of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In 1999, an elderly Viennese woman named Maria Altmann sued the Austrian government for the return of 5 Klimt paintings, including the iconic gold portrait of her aunt Adele Bloch-Bauer that had hung in the Palais Rothschild before being seized by the Nazis. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court and ended with the paintings being returned to Mrs. Altmann in 2006. She immediately sold them to Ronald Lauder for $135 million, the highest price ever paid for a single painting at the time. When the Austrian press accused her of profiteering, she replied simply, "They murdered my family. I am not obliged to subsidize Austrian amnesia." The Bloch-Bauer Klimt now hangs in the Neue Gallery in New York, but the empty spaces on the walls of the Belvedere Palace in Vienna still speak louder than any caption. In 2015, the French branch quietly bought back the Château de Lafite wine estate's original 18th century cellar master's house, which had been sold off in the 1950s to pay death duties, and discovered behind a false wall a cache of 200 bottles from the legendary 1870 vintage that the Germans had somehow missed. When the first cork was pulled in 2019, the wine was still alive, dark, perfumed, impossibly elegant. Baron Erich de Rothschild poured a glass for each of his children and said nothing. No toast, no speech, just the sound of centuries breathing. Today, if you walk through the public rooms of Waddesdon Manor in England, or the restored salons of Ferrières on a Heritage Day, you will see the Rothschild treasures displayed exactly as they were in 1900. The same Sèvres elephants, the same Savonnerie carpets, the same Fragonard panels glowing in the afternoon light. Visitors assume it is all original. Very few realize that almost every object has been hunted down and repatriated at staggering cost, that the family spent the equivalent of a medium-sized nation's art budget simply to make the past visible again. The palaces that were completely destroyed, Schillersdorf, Guntersburg, the Palais on Rengasse, exist now only in the yellowing photographs of the Rothschild archive and in the meticulous inventories compiled by the Nazis themselves. Those lists, once instruments of theft, have become the final testament to what was lost. The forgotten tale of the Rothschild palaces is therefore not a story of resurrection, but of survival against deliberate annihilation. The family never recovered the totality of its pre-war holdings. Entire branches were extinguished, entire libraries dispersed, entire landscapes of memory bulldozed. Yet in the places where the walls still stand, something stubborn and almost miraculous persists. The sense that beauty, once created, refuses to be entirely erased. The 5 arrows on the coat of arms, once a symbol of unbreakable unity, now point in every direction, scattered across continents and centuries. But wherever you find a Rothschild girandole lighting a museum corridor, or a Rothschild vine still growing along the gravel paths of Lafitte, or a single ivory piano key kept in a velvet-lined box in London, you are standing in the presence of a refusal to forget. And that, perhaps, is the truest inheritance Mayor Amschel left to his descendants. Not the gold, not the palaces, but the quiet, ferocious determination that memory itself is a form of resistance. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most poignant and least told chapters of 20th century history.